You begin in the soft light of morning beneath the Acropolis, where Athens rises above you in stone and memory. The city is already awake. You hear footsteps on the pavement, the murmur of distant traffic, the low hum of voices drifting up from the streets below, and yet even now there is something older than the morning all around you. You lift your eyes to the rock of the Acropolis, and for a moment the centuries seem to gather there at once. Temples, wars, prayers, triumphs, ruins, restorations, arguments, songs, and silences. All of them remain. All of them linger in this air. As you stand here, you begin to understand that Athens is not a city you simply look at. It is a city you enter layer by layer. Every path leads into another age. Every broken column and worn stone carries the weight of people who once believed their own moment would last forever. Below the sacred hill, modern Athens stretches outward in concrete, glass, balconies, cafes, and crowded avenues. But above it, the ancient heights still hold their ground. They do not erase the living city beneath them. They watch over it. They remind it. They challenge it. So this is where you begin. Not at the beginning of history, because Athens is older than any one beginning, but at the place where the city still introduces itself best, here, beneath the Acropolis. You are not simply visiting Athens. You are stepping into time itself. And now, before the philosophers, before the democracy, before the empire, before the marble brilliance of the Parthenon, you must go back to the first Athens, the rough hill, the sacred ground, the earliest refuge. You stand before the Acropolis rock and imagine it, before the marble, before the temples, before the city learned its own name. What rises above you now as a monument once rose as a shelter, a hard height of limestone in a plain where safety could never be taken for granted. Long before Athens became famous, people came here because this hill could be held. You look across the basin around you and sense how geography wrote the first line of the city's history. Mountains ring the land. The sea lies not far away. The ground opens, but never so widely that those who settled here could forget caution. This was a place to watch from, to store grain in, to defend, to survive. And then, like all ancient cities, Athens wrapped its beginnings in myth. You're told that Poseidon struck the rock and brought forth salt water, while Athena offered the olive tree. One gift promised force. The other promised endurance, nourishment, patience, and peace. The city chose Athena, and in that choice the Athenians later found a portrait of themselves, or at least of the people they hoped to be. So you pause here and picture the first settlement, half memory, half legend. Before Athens became an idea, it was simply a refuge. Before it became a school for the world, it was a hill, a people, and an olive tree. In that modest beginning, you can already feel the long future waiting silently beneath your feet. You leave the bare beginnings of the hill behind and descend toward the agora, where Athens first begins to sound like a city. Here the air feels fuller, busier, charged with exchange. You can almost hear merchants calling out, potters bargaining, farmers arriving with baskets, craftsmen measuring wood and bronze, and citizens pausing not only to trade goods, but to trade opinions. As you walk along the old civic ground, you enter an Athens still ruled largely by noble families, where birth carries weight and power settles unevenly across the land. The city is growing, but growth does not bring peace by itself. Too many farmers sink into debt. Too much land gathers in too few hands. Resentment rises quietly, then openly. You begin to sense that Athens is becoming more than a village of clans, yet has not learned how to become a fair city. In that tension, reform appears. You hear the name of Solon, a statesman called upon not to destroy the old order entirely, but to prevent the city from tearing itself apart. His reforms do not create democracy as later ages will remember it, yet they do something important. They loosen the grip of debt, redraw obligations, and give Athens room to breathe. As you continue onward, you realize that survival sometimes depends less on victory than on adjustment. But Athens does not move in a straight line. The city passes through tyranny as well. And under Pisistratus and his sons, power gathers in fewer hands even as public works and festivals strengthen a shared civic life. Along the Panathenaic Way, you imagine processions climbing upward toward Athena, citizens carrying offering, musicians playing, robes moving in sunlight. Religion, pride, spectacle, and politics all blend into one. By now the city feels restless, conscious of itself, not yet transformed, but ready. Athens is learning that law can restrain privilege, that ritual can unite strangers, and that a city divided by hardship must either reform itself or harden into bitterness. Here, among voices and footsteps, the long road toward democracy begins in earnest amid the noise of life. You climb toward the Pnyx, the rocky meeting place where Athens learned to hear itself speak. Here, under open sky, male citizens gathered to argue, persuade, accuse, and decide. The city no longer belonged only to great families or hidden councils. With the reforms of Cleisthenes, Athens was reorganized into something bold and unstable, a political experiment in which ordinary citizens, though never women, slaves, or foreigners, could claim a share of public power. As you stand there, you can imagine the murmur of debate rolling over the stone like wind. This was democracy in its first fierce form, proud and participatory, but narrow by modern standards and always vulnerable to fear, ambition, and manipulation. Even so, it changed history. Then the danger came from beyond the city. The Persian Empire advanced westward, and Athens found itself facing a power vast enough to crush smaller states without effort. At Marathon, against expectation, the Athenians helped win a victory that gave the city confidence out of all proportion to its size, but Persia returned, greater than before. This time, the crisis cut deeper. The Athenians abandoned their city, trusted their fleet, and watched as the Persians burned the Acropolis. You can almost see the smoke lifting into the sky where temples had stood. And yet that was not the end. At Salamis, on the water, Athenian skill and nerve helped turn the war. The city that had been embedded and burned emerged, not only alive but transformed. Its people had defended more than their homes. They had defended a new idea of political life. So as you leave the Pnyx and lift your eyes again to the Acropolis, you understand why ruin mattered so much to Athens. What was destroyed could be rebuilt. What had been tested could now be proclaimed. From debate, invasion, flight, fire, and victory, the city drew a harder confidence, one that would soon reshape the Greek world. Democracy had survived its first great ordeal, though not untouched. It would remain quarrelsome, unequal, brilliant, and dangerous. But now, Athens knew that citizens assembled on bare stone could choose not only laws, but destiny. That knowledge changed the city forever. It turned memory into purpose, and suffering into ambition. When the Athenians rebuilt their temples, they were rebuilding something larger than walls. They were rebuilding their claim to lead. and the whole Mediterranean would soon feel the force there. You begin the ascent to the Acropolis knowing that you are climbing toward the most famous image of Athens, but fame alone does not prepare you for the strange authority of this place. The slope rises beneath your feet. The city opens behind you, and the marble ahead seems to gather sunlight rather than merely reflect it. What was once a shattered sanctuary after the Persian invasion is now becoming, in your mind, the proud statement of a people determined to turn survival into splendor. You pass through the gateway and feel that Athens has arranged this arrival with deliberate care. The propylaea is not merely an entrance, it is a threshold between the ordinary city and a higher vision of itself. Here, the Athenians of the 5th century before Christ announced that their victory, their wealth, and their devotion to Athena deserved a setting unlike any other in Greece. Under Pericles, building became policy, beauty became argument, and stone became a language of power. Then you turn and see the Parthenon. Even in ruin, it commands the eye with a calm that feels almost impossible. Its columns do not stand like rigid lines, but with subtle curves and refinement that make the whole structure seem alive, poised, exact, and serene. This is not architecture seeking only to shelter a cult image. It is Athens presenting itself to the world as disciplined, rational, victorious, and favored by the gods. Yet the brilliance before you was paid for in part by tribute drawn from an empire of allies who did not always remain willing allies. As you move across the sacred plateau, the whole Acropolis unfolds as a conversation in marble. The temple of Athena Nike speaks of victory. The Erechtheion, with its caryatids, suggests grace, mystery, and the city's reverence for ancient cults, older than the confidence of empire. Everywhere you look, sculpture, proportion, and ritual combine. Athens is not decorating itself, it is defining itself. This is civic religion and political self-display at once. A declaration that the city stands at the center of the Greek world and knows it. From this height, you also understand the contradiction that lies at the heart of the Golden Age. Athens speaks the language of freedom, yet governs others. It celebrates debate, yet excludes most who live within its reach. It honors wisdom, yet is never free from ambition. The greatness of the city becomes more impressive, not less, when you admit its tensions. Periclean Athens was not a flawless paradise. It was a bold, restless society using art, ceremony, and public confidence to shape how it wished to be seen, both by its citizens and by those beyond its walls. Then you descend toward the theater of Dionysus on the southern slope, and the city changes shape again. Here, Athenians did not only worship or vote, they watched themselves. In tragedy and comedy, they saw power, justice, grief, pride, folly, and the will of the gods placed before them in human form. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes. These were not ornaments to Athenian life. They were part of its civic mind. The same city that raised temples of marble also filled hillside seats to hear its fears and hopes spoken aloud. As you stand there at last, with the theater below and the Parthenon above, you see why this age still governs the imagination. Athens made beauty inseparable from politics and thought inseparable from public life. It built in stone, argued in assemblies, and dreamed on stage. For a moment, the city seems to believe that greatness and permanence may be one thing. You leave the bright confidence of Periclean Athens and descend into a darker chapter where the city that seemed so sure of itself begins to tremble. The Peloponnesian War stretches on year after year, and what once looked like strength now turns inward under pressure. Behind the walls, people crowd together for safety as Spartan armies ravage the countryside. Yet safety becomes its own danger. Disease moves through the packed city, and Athens, so proud of reason and order, finds itself helpless before the plague. You walk in imagination toward the Kerameikos, where the dead were carried and remembered, and the scale of loss becomes harder to ignore. The names of generals and statesmen still matter, but here history narrows to grief. Families vanish, customs break down, fear weakens law, piety, and trust. The city that built temples and staged tragedies now lives inside one. War continues even after sickness has done its work. In the assembly, ambition still speaks loudly. The disastrous expedition to Sicily reveals how easily confidence can become blindness. Athens sends ships, men, and hopes across the sea, and loses them almost beyond recovery. From then on, defeat is no longer a distant possibility, it is a shadow walking beside the city. When Sparta finally prevails, Athens must face humiliation as well as sorrow. Power fractures, oligarchs and democrats struggle. Certainty disappears. Yet the city does not fall silent. In the agora, argument continues. In its schools and streets, thought deepens under pressure. Out of political failure comes a harder kind of inquiry. You think here of Socrates moving through Athens with questions sharper than any weapon. He leaves no temple, commands no army, founds no empire. Yet he becomes one of the city's enduring voices. His trial and execution reveal a democracy wounded enough to fear the man who forced it to examine itself. Athens had survived invasion and war, but it could not always bear reflection. So you stand among these memories and understand that greatness now is never, secure. Athens in defeat remains astonishing, not because it escapes error, but because it turns suffering into thought. The city loses its innocence here, perhaps forever. What remains is less radiant than before, but deeper, sadder, and more human. You leave this part of the walk knowing that the most monuments of Athens are not only marble and law, but questions asked in the aftermath of ruin. You pass now into an Athens that has lost command without losing prestige. After Cheronea, the city can no longer pretend that it will lead Greece by force of speech or fleet. Macedon has settled that question on the battlefield. The old freedom of action narrows. Decisions of war and empire move elsewhere. Yet, as you walk through the city, you sense that defeat has not emptied Athens of significance. It has changed the kind of significance Athens possesses. The streets still carry memory. The schools still gather students. The names of Plato and Aristotle continue to shape the way thought is pursued, even when political power has slipped beyond the city's reach. In the academy and the lyceum, or in the idea of them that survives in every retelling, Athens becomes a place where minds are trained even as governments are lost. The city that once commanded allies now commands attention. There is something almost elegiac in this version of Athens. You are walking through a place that knows it has outlived its own peak, yet refuses to become irrelevant. Its monuments still speak. Its teachers still argue. Its reputation still travels farther than its authority. In this Hellenistic world, kingdoms rise and maneuver across vast territories. But Athens remains what conquerors cannot easily manufacture for themselves, a center of memory, learning, and inherited greatness. Here, Power fades into influence, and influence becomes its own form of survival long after armies have decided what cities may no longer choose. You move now from the older civic heart toward a different Athens, one shaped by Roman admiration and Roman rule. Conquest did not erase the city. Instead, it gave Athens a new role within a wider world. Roman elites came here to study rhetoric, philosophy, and manners, as though the city had become a finishing school for power. You are walking through a place that no longer commands the Mediterranean, yet still teaches it how prestige should sound. In the Roman agora, the atmosphere shifts. The space feels more ordered, more imperial, but not severed from what came before. Nearby stands the Tower of the Winds, practical and elegant, a reminder that Athens continued to build, adapt, and serve daily life, even while carrying the burden of its past. The old city and the newer city do not cancel each other, they accumulate. Then you come to Hadrian's presence in Athens. Few Roman emperors loved Greek culture more openly, and his patronage left a visible mark. The library of Hadrian, the completion of the temple of Olympian Zeus, and the broader reshaping of the city all declare that Athens still mattered to scholars, pilgrims, officials, and travelers who wished to stand close to the source of Greek fame. Even the Arch of Hadrian seems to announce a city balanced between inheritance and renewal, between what was ancient and what Rome wished to honor, claim, and continue. Yet Roman Athens was not only a museum of old glory, it was also a place where new faiths and older loyalties met. On the Areopagus, Christian tradition remembers St. Paul speaking to Athenians about the unknown God, and whether or not every listener understood him, the moment captures a city standing at the edge of religious change. Pagan sanctuaries watched over the streets, but a future had entered the conversation. As you walk on, you feel Rome's gift to Athens was time. The city could not rule as it once had, yet it could endure, teach, borrow, and be borrowed from. Under empire, Athens remained itself by learning how to belong to something larger. You turn away now from the grand clarity of the classical and Roman city and enter an Athens that many histories pass over too quickly. Yet, as you move into the narrower streets of Plaka and the older quarters below the Acropolis, you begin to understand that Athens did not vanish after antiquity. It endured by becoming smaller, quieter, more provincial, and more intimate. The city lost prominence, but it did not lose life. In the Byzantine centuries, Athens became part of a Christian world that read the ancient stones differently. Temples were no longer only temples. Some became churches. Sacred meaning shifted, but the buildings remained in use, altered, and reimagined rather than abandoned. You can still feel that change in the modest Byzantine churches tucked into the city, where brick, plaster, and devotion speak in a different register from the marble confidence of the 5th century before Christ. Athens was no longer the school of the world in quite the same way. It was a town of priests, craftsmen, householders, and pilgrims living among the remnants of older greatness. Then came the age of Frankish rule after the Fourth Crusade, when Western lords and Latin institutions layered themselves onto Greek ground. The Acropolis, which had already served many purposes across the centuries, remained what it had always been in one essential sense, the commanding height. Whoever ruled Athens understood that this rock was not merely symbolic, it was strategic. Its meanings changed with every regime, but its authority over the landscape did not. Under Ottoman rule, Athens continued as a modest provincial town. This was not the sprawling capital you know today, nor the imperial city of Pericles, but a smaller settlement of markets, houses, mosques, churches, and everyday routines. The ancient monuments stayed present, not as isolated museum pieces, but as parts of lived space. The Parthenon itself became first a church, and later a mosque. That single building, perhaps more than any other, reveals the truth of Athens across the centuries. Each age inherited the city, adapted it, and left its own imprint on the same enduring stone. As you walk, you begin to see that continuity in real use. A city survives not only by preserving monuments exactly as they were, but by finding new meanings for them. Athens did this again and again, and yet survival had its costs. In 1687, during the Venetian bombardment of the Ottoman-held Acropolis, the Parthenon, used as a powder magazine, was struck and catastrophically damaged. The explosion shattered what centuries of change had not destroyed. That loss still echoes. But even here, Athens was not reduced to silence. In its lanes, in its houses, in its churches and mosques, in the daily life of people whose names are mostly gone, the city continued. The Athens of these centuries may not have ruled the imagination of Europe in the way classical Athens did, but it kept the thread unbroken. It carried the ancient city through the medieval and early modern world, not as a memory alone, but as a place still inhabited, still altered, and still alive. You leave the older quarters and emerge into the 19th century, where Athens begins to change not by gradual inheritance alone, but by deliberate design. After the Greek War of Independence, the city that would become the capital of a new kingdom was still small, scarred, and uncertain of its future. It possessed immortal ruins, but not yet the shape of a modern capital. What you see now had to be imagined before it could be built. As you move toward Syntagma Square, the city opens into broader spaces and straighter lines. The old royal palace, severe and orderly, speaks a language different from the winding streets below the Acropolis. Here, modern Greece tried to give political form to historical memory. Athens was chosen as the capital not because it was then the largest or richest city, but because its ancient name carried an authority that could help define the new nation in the eyes of Europe and in its imagination. You feel this ambition in the neoclassical avenues and public buildings that followed. Architects and planners shaped a capital that looked backward to classical Athens, even while serving the practical needs of a modern state. The university, the academy, and the National Library formed not merely an ensemble of buildings, but a statement about continuity, education, and legitimacy. Greece was presenting itself as heir to antiquity and participant in modern Europe at once. Yet there was a cost to this vision. To reveal the ancient city, many later layers around the Acropolis were cleared away, as though the truest Athens belonged chiefly to its classical past. Even so, the modern capital took root. What had been a modest town became a stage where kings, parliaments, soldiers, and citizens would struggle to define Greece beneath the gaze of stones. You step now into an Athens far closer to living memory, though no less shaped by upheaval. The modern city spread not in calm confidence, but through shock, displacement, hunger, argument, and reinvention. As you move through Omonia and Syntagma, past traffic, shop fronts, apartment blocks, and hurried crowds, you begin to feel a different kind of history underfoot. One carried not only by monuments, but by grandparents, newspapers, photographs, and unfinished conversations. In the early 20th century, refugees from Asia Minor poured into Athens after catastrophe, bringing grief, labor, customs, music, and new neighborhoods. The city expanded under pressure. Then came occupation during the Second World War. German forces entered Athens, and the city endured fear, deprivation, and famine. Public squares, now alive with buses and pedestrians, once held a sharper silence. Survival itself became an act of endurance. Liberation did not bring immediate peace. In the 1940s, Athens became one of the central stages of political conflict and civil strife. The wounds of occupation opened into new divisions, and the city learned that victory over one enemy does not end the struggle over a nation's future. Even today, certain streets still seem to remember those years of suspicion, gunfire, and bitterness. Afterward came rapid growth. Concrete apartment buildings rose across the basin, often quickly, sometimes harshly, housing a population that seemed always to be arriving from somewhere else. What had once been a smaller capital became a vast urban landscape. Yet Athens never lost its habit of exposing the past in the middle of the present. In metro stations, ancient graves and walls appeared beneath the work of modern transport, as though the city refused to travel forward without showing where it had come from. Then there was dictatorship from 1967 to 1974, when public life again narrowed under fear and control. But that, too, passed. Democracy returned. Protest returned. Debate returned. By the time of the 2004 Olympics, Athens sought once more to present itself to the world, modern, capable, and renewed. The economic crisis that followed brought hardship and anger, but not surrender. So you end this stretch of the walk in a city of contradictions. Burdened and creative, wounded and outspoken, crowded and luminous, forever arguing with itself and forever alive. Its cafes fill, its students march, its artists improvise, and above the noise the Acropolis still watches, reminding every generation that Athens survives by changing again. You climb at last to a high place above Athens, perhaps Lycabettus, perhaps Philopapos, and the city spreads beneath you like a long conversation between centuries. The Acropolis still rises from the center, but around it stretch apartment blocks, church domes, market streets, traffic, terraces, schools, ministries, and neighborhoods that hold memories too recent to be called ancient, and burdens too old to be forgotten. From here, Athens is not one city at all. It is many cities laid one upon another. The refuge on the rock, the city of Athena, the democracy, the empire, the school of philosophers, the Roman monument, the Byzantine town, the Ottoman settlement, the neoclassical capital, the occupied city, the protesting city, the modern metropolis that keeps uncovering its own foundations. You look out and understand that Athens endured not because it stayed unchanged, but because it never did. Kings, reformers, generals, monks, merchants, refugees, workers, students, and families all left their mark here. And so the walk ends where all true walks through Athens end, with the knowledge that history in this city is never fully past. It remains underfoot, overhead, and alive within view for anyone willing to stop, listen, remember, and look again.